All right, we're back at the shop, and if you thought I was irresponsible and left everything all uncovered, come on, you guys know me better than that. I at least rested the valve covers in place to keep any dust and dirt out while I was away, but we are back, so I'm going to lift those off, and we're going to start working on timing up the cams to the crank. Now the good thing is, it's a pretty straightforward process. Again, earlier in this build you saw that the crank locking tool and the cam locking tools. The nice thing is those basically guarantee that there is only one place that these things can be positioned, and it makes sure that everything is in time. So I'm going to walk you through basically how I do this, and by the end of this video we should have everything all timed, and my goal is to just turn over the crank by hand a couple times just to make sure there's no valve to piston contact. Because that is a real fast way to have a real bad time. Now, one thing you'll learn working on cars is to always double check yourself. So I'm just making sure that I do in fact have the crank locking pin in place, and we do. And you can see it hanging out right there. So as you can see, all four cams are in place. I basically pre-lubricated all of the followers, the lobes, before putting those in. Made sure everything, at least had a baseline amount of oil on it. Now essentially we're going to be tightening the cams down. So thankfully earlier we labeled all of the caps for the cams, so we know that all of these are in the correct location. They're going back exactly where they came off, because these things wear in and bed in together, right? So basically, remembering from earlier in the series, we want these flats to be facing up. Because all of the valves are currently up, you'll notice that this cam, for instance, is sitting up and away because it is pressing down on this lobe here. So basically we're going to need to seat these cams down into place using those little caps. Now, I can't tell you if this is textbook correct or not, but honestly the method I normally use is to basically just evenly and slowly tighten the caps down to keep the cam as level as possible while seating it down. So just doing a little bit at a time and making sure that the cam's not at an angle as it seats into the head. You want to try and keep it as level as possible, and then just ever so slightly work it down until it's seated the whole way. Then do your torque sequence properly, make sure everything's torqued to spec, and move on. Now, another thing that might alleviate a little bit of stress is remembering which pistons are up and which pistons are down. So essentially, on the driver's side here, we know that the front two pistons are currently at the top of their stroke, and we know that the rear two pistons are currently towards the bottom of their stroke. So we know we got two up, two down. On the passenger side over here, we know that we have this one is up, this one is down, this one is up, this one is down. So that'll help you, kind of allay any fears you might have about, as you tighten these down, about pushing the valves into the pistons, because you can literally see which of the valves you're going to be opening. So in this case, these lobes are up and out of the way, these lobes are up and out of the way, so we know that on this exhaust cam here, even though these front two pistons are up, they're the ones that are at risk. Essentially, we're not going to be pushing these valves down into the cylinder, but we are pushing these rear two down into the cylinder. So essentially, we know that even though these valves are going to push into the cylinder, we know that those pistons are down and we're not going to have a clearance issue. Same at the back here, and actually, interestingly, all four of our sets of lobes are clear. We're not pushing any valves down here. And we'll do one quick check here as well, just to make sure we're all looking good on this side too. So again, we know that this one is up, right? But these lobes and these lobes are not making contact with the valves. We're not pushing any valves. Then we know that this one is down, so it really doesn't matter if we open any valves. And you can sort of see we're actually pretty much not opening any valves anyway on either of these. We know that this guy is up, so we got to watch him. It looks like these lobes are not making contact here. And it looks like the same can be said down here. It looks like they are not making contact down here, so we're safe on this cylinder. And lastly, this one, which is down, so again, it does not matter. So again, that's an easy check to, just make sure you're not going to cause any trouble. If you do find that you're in a situation where you feel like you're going to be pushing valves down into a cylinder that's up, double check these. Make sure these are as close to flat as possible. Obviously mine are not right now, but this was the positioning that got me closest to that. And that's what's allowing this to all just conveniently work out the way it does. If you're having trouble with these interfering, consider rotating the cam to a different position to try and get these a little closer to the top, and that should help you out. Now these are done up to a very low torque spec. So to start with, you're gonna wanna work with a very safe tool. In this instance, my hand and an 8mm socket. Literally, I'm just doing these down by hand, no wrench on this, and I'm literally just turning the caps down, keeping them level and even. I'm gonna do my best to film this so you can see, but essentially we're trying to draw the back down a little bit more in relation to the front. We're just a little high here, and I've been working my way back and forth along. So my last run put the front down a little more, so now we're gonna put the back down a little more. Just try and keep it level. So you see how I'm doing the top and then the bottom and then the top and then the bottom, just to make sure that I'm walking this on evenly. You don't want to overdo it because then your geometry will get funny. And then as you do that, I'm also distributing the load and kind of making sure that I'm not just using one cap to take all the weight and pull it all the way down. I'm essentially sharing that between these two that are both at this end. So in that last pass right there, we basically just leveled the cam out to where it's back to being pretty flush. So essentially, and again, you can see, you know, it's pretty quick, but you just gotta go slow and steady, pay attention to detail. So I'm just gonna draw the back in just a little more here. I'm gonna do this guy like that. And again, just work your way along exactly like what you see me doing here until you've made contact and these are touching the cylinder head. All right, that was pretty quick and painless. So we now have all 4 cams seated down, basically just kind of situated but not torqued to spec. Now, earlier I mentioned that this is quite a light torque spec, so these need to be done from 9 to 11 Newton meters, which I believe is roughly 8 foot-pounds, and I think that's 97 inch-pounds roughly as well. Here's the problem. I don't have my torque wrench with me that will go that low. I have an inch-pound torque wrench and completely forgot to bring it with me, and my foot-pound torque wrench does not go that low. So I'm gonna come back to torquing these the whole way down. We've at least got them seated, but I guess I'm gonna move on to, I think, doing a little bit of cleanup, and then we'll get these torqued down on the next run. But man, does it feel good to have everything kind of sitting where it's supposed to. This thing looks absolutely clean and fresh. I'm very, very excited. And don't worry, if I understand the way this works, I think I can do all of the timing set and everything like that before actually torquing those bolts down to spec, because the reality is it doesn't matter if they're in time or not when you do that step. So I am still gonna do the timing chains and everything, and then the next time I come back up, I'll just hit it with the torque wrench, get them torqued to spec, and we're good to roll. So step 1 here is gonna be getting your cam locking bars in place. So I've got mine in place, as you can see. They are cranked down. The cams are now locked in time with the crank. We know everything is exactly where it's supposed to sit as far as the timing of the engine, top end and bottom end together. Now, these were a little bit fiddly to get in because, as you saw, the flats were not necessarily lined up with where they needed to be. The method I found best was essentially to start putting the bars in place and kind of get them down to where they just started to touch the points of the flats that were on, the high spots of them. And then essentially just try to rotate the cams into position while slowly kind of, seating that down gently. You don't want to necessarily try and crank these down and hope that the cam is going to naturally rotate into position. So essentially I grabbed a pair of these guys and basically as lightly as possible just gripped onto the middle here where this flat spot is, and basically just made sure without letting it slip. You definitely don't want to let it slip. You don't want little bits of metal or anything to come off, even though these are hardened. And basically just was able to lever the cam just slightly, and then with my free hand, tighten that bolt down, and then obviously it wouldn't come back because it was now touching the bar. So that was a good method that worked for both of these. Also, on the last one, I figured out that you can actually use the flat of this tool right here, which comes with the kit. This back edge here can go into the 2 slots, at least on the exhaust cam, and that makes it really easy to just gently lever it into place. I wish I had actually done that first, honestly. That would have worked better. However, it doesn't necessarily help you on this cam, because you definitely don't want to mess with these. These are your cam position sensors. So anyway, I hope that helps, but these are locked in place, and now we're going to move on to getting on the tensioners and chains and all that shenanigans. So first things first, we're going to want to get our secondary tensioners and secondary chains on. That's the one that links the 2 cams together. Obviously, those are the further back setups, so we want to start with those. So I believe the first step is going to be putting the actual tensioners on and basically bolting those onto the cylinder head. So it looks like it's suggested to use a little bit of thread locker, like Loctite, and then basically just torque them to spec. And make sure you're paying attention to which side the tensioner goes on. If you are reusing yours, just make sure you know which side they came off of. If you have new ones, they usually are labeled. So for instance, this one right here, if you can see it, has an R on it. So that means right side. And again, when referring to the right side of a vehicle, usually that is as you are sitting in the vehicle. So the right side is if you're holding the steering wheel sitting in the driver's seat, it's your right. So if you're facing the front of the engine like we are right now, it's actually the left side. So keep that in mind. So as you can tell, I have new secondary chains and tensioners. One of them was bad on mine, and I just decided to replace both of them. I believe I purchased these from JaguarTimingKits.com. And basically, 2 new tensioners, new hardware, and 2 new chains. And the ones I got, interestingly enough, have a link where it looks like you can actually separate the chain, which is kind of a cool touch. This is less important when you're as far apart as we are here, but if you're just doing your upper chains and tensioners, it's a really nice touch because it allows you to do the service without having to take your primary chains off. So that's kind of a cool thing, honestly. I actually quite like that. So yeah, anyway, if you buy the kit, I believe they have the option of this type of chain. Just decide if it's right for you or not. So we are going to be starting with the left side of the engine here. Again, left driver's side. And basically, we're going to be putting the tensioner on. Now, the tensioner is pre-packed with this little locking pin in place. And the nice thing is it's easy to tell which way up it goes because there's only one flat surface that will bolt down. There's this little bump in the way here, so if you tried to put it on upside down, you physically can't. So that should alleviate some of your worries. Again, this is labeled left, so we know it is for the left side of the engine. And then basically, you're not gonna be able to get it on with these sprockets in place. So you're gonna want to, I'm gonna just try pulling them forward first to see if I can maybe scoot this big one enough out of the way. Worst case, you can take them the whole way off. But I'm gonna get that started and we're gonna get this guy bolted on. And, again, we're starting with the left side because that is the further back. So this will have the primary chain that basically comes towards the back side here. And then this one's primary chain will come in front of it. So it makes sense to do them in that order. Again, the secondaries doesn't matter as much, but I'm gonna basically just do it in sequence anyway. So I'm gonna install the driver's side tensioner now. I ended up just removing the large sprocket. And basically, like I said, you have the 2 bolts that come with it. We're gonna put a little bit of Loctite on these, and they're done to up to 14 Newton meters or about 10 foot-pounds. And I do have a torque wrench that will do 10 foot-pounds with me, so I can at least get that done. All right, we have our tensioner installed. So now we're gonna work on our secondary chain. So like I said, I've got this loosened to where I can pull this sprocket forward if I need to, and which I will. And then I can probably bring a little more of that bolt out because I'm gonna need more than that. And we are going to do the same treatment on this side and then basically put the chain around the 2, slide it over, and then we'll start to work it back. But there's no point seating it the whole way down just yet because to get our primary chain on there, we're gonna need to clear the face of this. If you remember earlier in the video, to remove it, we had to pull it forward. We're gonna have to do the same thing to install it. And there we have it. So essentially, I pre-lubricated the chain with our little pot of oil here. I basically just dunked it in the chain and kind of, spun it around, made sure it got nice and saturated, just so it wasn't dry going on there. The sprockets already had some residual oil on them, so that was fine. Essentially, I pulled the large sprocket forward, looped the chain over the large sprocket, and also looped it around this bolt here, then seated it onto the teeth of this one, and then basically, I popped this sprocket forward, which allowed it to move freely, seated that into the chain as well, and then basically wiggled both of them back onto their seats and over the tensioner. It was pretty straightforward. And so basically, yeah, that chain, this is just a rough idea of how it will sit once it's all in. Again, we are gonna have to pull this whole assembly back forward to do our primary chain, but I wanted you to see what it will look like in situ. Still a little bit of a freaky concept to me that these sprockets are not on a keyed shaft to these cams, but truly these free spin on the cams, check that out. So I'm gonna figure out the proper sequence. I'm certain there's just basically a torque spec where it guarantees those are locked to it, and my guess would be the rotation direction of the engine somewhat guarantees you'll never end up with a situation where it backs out, but I will do a little more research on that, and we're gonna make sure we do it exactly right. But for now, that is on there, and I'm going to repeat this process on the other side. And as seems to have been the story of this project, I was moving on and ran into a bit of a snag. I was getting ready to reinstall the guide for the driver's side here, and noticed like the plastic, as much as it was, initially when I showed you in the removal, it's got like just a little bit of grooving, but it seemed really good. And then I noticed like a little notch there, so I looked closer. I don't know how I missed this when I first took this off, but yeah, it ain't supposed to look like that. So at some point, this was wrong in some way, shape, or form, and the chain has just eaten into the side of this guide. And you can see here on the chain itself, see that polished edge there? That is where it has been rubbing on that guide. So when I first took these off, I missed that. So it looks like I will be going back to JaguarTimingKits.com and ordering the primary chains and guides. It most likely makes financial sense at this point just to get both for, each side and knock it out, which is really annoying because I should have just ordered them at the same time as the secondary tensioners, but honestly, I didn't see that when I took it out. So that kind of stops us in our tracks for now, but I'm gonna move on to doing some cleaning. When you're feeling sorry for yourself, cleaning up some parts is a great way to make some progress and at least have a nice outcome. So like most timing covers, this thing is pretty gross. So I'm gonna basically clean off the dirt and oil residue and just get this thing as bright as I possibly can. And I'm also gonna pop out the little seal there as well. All right, so here's the first round of cleaning. Essentially, I'm just using some brake parts cleaner, a rag, and I'm actually using a Scotch-Brite pad and just real lightly going to try and kind of knock some of the dirt and residue that's kind of actually bedded into the aluminum. So, it's a little uneven at the moment, but essentially the idea is I'm going to do this in a couple of rounds and try and get it semi-uniform. My goal is not necessarily to get this thing looking like brand new and perfect. I just want to get it to where it's all somewhat bright like that. If it's a little bit splotchy or whatever, it's not the end of the world. It will still look way better than it did. And as far as removing the seal that was in here, I actually just took a rubber mallet and thumped it out from the inside, and that worked really well. So yeah, probably not gonna be able to use the exact same technique for reinstallation, but at least for removal, my rubber mallet was smaller than the opening here, and I was able to just kind of thump it right out. So yeah, that seemed to work. Okay, we are back with what is hopefully going to be a momentous day on the Jag, and that is getting the timing done once and for all. That was supposed to be last video. Obviously, we ran into the new exciting thing with the guides, but the new parts have arrived. They look good, so we're gonna walk you through what we're doing here. So this is the new guide, and you'll notice a distinct lack of missing metal there. So this thing looks good. It definitely fits. I've just started threading this little guy in here. If you remember from the removal, it is just this single bolt. So everything's looking good so far with the kit. It all looks correct. And of course, step one is to put this guide in. So I'm gonna figure out what the torque spec is for these. And great news, I finally remembered to bring my inch-pound torque wrench. Which, by the way, look at this collection of torque wrenches. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we have 6 torque wrenches here now, thanks to all of this nonsense. You definitely don't need 6. We've just ended up that way. So I'll figure out the torque spec. We're gonna get that bolted in. And then the next step after that is to actually get the chain looped on, which if you remember, we have to pull this gear forward so that we can get past the front face here of the cylinder head. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm gonna be using an inch-pound torque wrench for accuracy's sake. I feel like it's just a little more forgiving when you're dealing with the low values. So the cam hold down caps basically are 9 to 11 Newton meters. I'm gonna go anywhere from 90 to 95 inch-pounds of torque, inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. That should be kind of towards the upper end of that, but not surpassing that. The front main guide, the one you just saw me putting in, That should be running, I want to say, anywhere from 90 to 120 inch-pounds, so just a little bit higher. I believe that's anywhere from 10 to 11 Newton meters. So in essence, it should be pretty straightforward. I'm just going to go through and torque all of these down. If you're using a foot-pound torque wrench, I believe it's like 7-ish foot-pounds for the cam hold downs, and the front tensioner, I want to say, should be roughly 8. And moments later, we are back, and I have just thrown away my inch-pound torque wrench because it seems to be the recurring thing is us having broken torque wrenches. So I have ordered a new torque wrench, a different style for the inch-pound. It's called a beam style. You should look it up. It's kind of a cool thing. So thankfully, it'll be here tomorrow, courtesy of Amazon Prime. But for now, we are going to move into doing the front timing set, because at least that is stuff I know I can work with the existing bigger torque wrenches that I do have. I have one working torque wrench that can do low enough ratings in foot-pounds. But yeah, for those cam caps, I don't want to use this. And on top of that, my inch-pound one, I have no idea what it was doing, and that's not a situation you want to be in when you're dealing with really precise tolerances with things that are spinning at high RPM being held in a very certain way. So we're going to dive into doing at least the front timing set. We'll come back and use the other style of torque wrench to double check those bolts, make sure that those are torqued to spec. So we have our first guide in place. We're starting on the driver's side in our US spec car. And basically, one of the first checks I did was to make sure that the alignment looks good. And as you can see, when we get right above it, these are seated as far back as it'll go on the cams. And the alignment basically looks like it should fall dead center on that guide. So we're going to check it once the chain's on, but I'm already feeling good that we won't have the same issue again. So next up, we're putting our lower sprocket on. This is keyed, as you can see. And there is a dot, and I'm going to double check, but I believe the dot is supposed to face outward. And then this one goes on first, which is for the driver's side, and then once you do the passenger side, that one goes on afterwards. All right, so I did verify the first one that we just put on should have the dot facing outward, and when you put the second one on, the dot should be facing inward. Essentially, the dots should be touching each other, and what that will yield, essentially, is sprockets that are one tooth sort of out of phase with each other. So you'll have two teeth here and one tooth kind of sitting between the two, and I'll show you what that looks like. So again, our first one is on with the dot facing out. It slid all the way back. The key is basically locking it in place. And we've got our second one, and we're putting the dot facing in so that it touches the other dot. And you see how the teeth are out of phase, right? So that is from what my research shows, and also from how my car came apart, that is what it should look like. And just to show you, if you have it wrong, if you have this 180 out, so again, it'll still go in because it's keyed, but you see how these teeth now line up? That is incorrect. So again, you want it to where the teeth do not line up like this. You want it to where they're offset like that. So I've removed the second sprocket for now. I'm just working on this first one. We're going to get this chain in place. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to have to pull this sprocket forward, which means we're actually going to have to slide both of these forward and kind of clear this little guy here. And I still have these bolts loose so that I can move this whole assembly forward. And then we're basically going to loop our new chain around this whole assembly, and then essentially slide it all back in and make sure everything looks good. And as you can see, we now have the primary chain on. So all I did was slide that sprocket forward a little bit, slide these forward a little bit, loop the chain over the bottom first, and then up around the top. These obviously, again, had to slide off as an assembly, and then basically slid everything back so it tucked under there nicely. Much like I did with the secondary chain, I pre-oiled this chain. I basically just ran it through this oil here. And as you can see, I've lovely dripped some oil on my newly cleaned sump there, but whatever, I can wipe that up. So now you can kind of see how I've got it sitting. We're going to install our kind of tensioner arm, which is like the upper guide pretty much. So we're going to grab the bolt for that, torque that up. And one of my things that I've been concerned about, and from everything I'm seeing, it looks like isn't really a thing on this type of car. There's not really like a certain tooth or mark or anything like that that you have to make sure lines up with this. Because you have your cams locked in place, you have your crank locked in place, as long as this is tensioned properly and set properly following the right procedure, I think once you lock these gears in place, everything just sort of works. So if that's how it works, it's actually kind of a cool design, because I remember on the 4.6 with the whole make sure this dot and that dot point this direction and there's a certain colored link on the chains and all that nonsense, that can be pretty stressful. So we'll see, follow along and we'll get that discovered together, but I believe that's how it works. And we now have our upper tensioner arm, or guide, if you want to call it that, in place. So this was the piece of hardware, if you remember, that had the little collar on it. If yours is a VVT car, it might look a little different, but basically I just used the hardware that came out of the original tensioner, as the kit did not come with new hardware for this, nor did it come with new hardware for the bottom guide either. I've basically, both these surfaces, I've pre-lubricated those as well, just doing everything in my power to minimize any dry contact when we do eventually get to the first start here. And just want to show you guys, again, I did that double check we talked about, and the alignment on this chain looks really good. It does not make contact with the back of the guide, so we have nice clearance there, which is clearly something that was an issue on the previous setup. And same deal with the way this one has both a front and a back track. It falls naturally in the right place. So everything's looking good alignment wise. So I think we're set. We're now going to put the upper tensioner in, same deal. We'll be reusing the old hardware on that. And I believe this is done up to roughly 10 foot-pounds of torque. And same deal on these guys right here. And I have seen it recommended that on the upper tensioner you use a little bit of Loctite as well, just to keep it locked in place, much like the upper tensioner. So again, lower tensioner and upper tensioner both seem to use a little bit of Loctite. From what I understand, both of the lower tensioners are the same. They're not handed like the upper ones. I'll verify that momentarily. So we're gonna get this thing installed. And our tensioner is in. So basically those are all torqued up. They have the little bit of thread locker on them, and we are leaving the pin in for now. We're going to just move on to the next part of the process. So next up, you insert the shim tools like this, and basically these are used to keep tension on the chain itself without having to release the pin. And then what we're going to do is tighten up these guys, which are 10 mil Allens, except we're going to use it on a torque wrench, which I've got somewhere over there. And these are going to be done up to 115 to 125 Newton meters, which is about 85 foot-pounds of torque. So quite a bit, but still doable. On the non-VVT cars, both of these are the same. If you have a VVT car, look up the specs, because it does vary on the intake cam, so just be careful with that. And if you have a second person, this will be significantly easier, but essentially you're going to want to use this tool right here, and you're going to lock this sprocket. And most likely you're going to need to use a breaker bar. You see we've got ours ready to go, which will clip right into that square there. And that'll let you keep tension the other way while you're tightening this bolt. So like I said, two people makes it a lot easier. James is going to give me a hand with this. And then yeah, same deal on the other side. And with a little bit of movie magic, this side is now done. So as I mentioned before, process on this side is very much the same. Torque specs are the same. Order of operations is the same. It's just basically that your primary guide now sits up on top and your curved tensioner guide sits down on the bottom. But you know, if you imagine this side just flipped like this, it's exactly the same thing. So this is now all done. The next step is to remove our cam locks. And with those removed, you can now see that we have the flats of our cams both pointing upward in the correct orientation, which is awesome. And on the side that they were wrong on before, they are now correct. So the last step is to remove the crank locking tool, which is underneath and is what's kind of locking the flywheel in place. I'm gonna pop under there and pull that out. And from there, we should be able to gently turn the engine over by hand and make sure that there's no clearance issues, no valves touching pistons, things like that. But because we locked everything in time and we put everything back nice and carefully, that really should not be an issue, but we're gonna find out. And of course, while you're under there pulling this guy out, don't forget to put your crank position sensor back in place. You should use the same bolt, obviously. I used the crank position sensor bolt to hold this in place. So I basically just swapped them back out. This came out real easy. There was no tension on it or anything like that, which means we did a really good job up top, not putting load, not moving anything through the crankshaft. So that's a really good sign. And now for the final step, and kind of a rewarding one. We're gonna pull the locking pins out of all 4 of our tensioners. That's the red guys right there. So I'm gonna pull all of those out, and we should at that point be ready to turn the engine over and make sure everything is in time. So I started rummaging around for the crank bolt and was about to get that threaded in, and realized honestly what time it is, running a little bit behind, and I was supposed to be somewhere else. So we're gonna cut it for today, but we will turn the engine over at the beginning of the next clip. So follow along for that, obviously. Thank you for following, and this is a huge day. Again, seeing all of the timing chains in there, seeing it all together and timed up properly is a giant step compared to what it was when we took it apart. This is huge. So again, if we successfully turn the motor over and there's no issues with the timing cover goes back on, we start to put the accessories back on. The reassembly goes pretty darn quickly at that point because it is just stuff. It's real easy. There's very few things that have like specifics other than just torque specs. So I'm very optimistic that this thing's gonna come back together in quite a hustle. And as always, if you haven't already, we figured out I think 95% of the people watching our videos aren't subscribed. There's a chance that you've been following this process and haven't even thought about it. So if you followed more than one of these videos, please hit that subscribe button. Really helps us grow, and it seems to me like you might want to see the next one as well. So I think that helps us both out. And of course, if you really like the videos, you can turn on that bell notification icon. That'll let you know when the video is released so you can follow along as we go. And of course, you're letting us figure it out so that you can just follow along and have a smooth process yourself. If you really love us, consider going over to our Patreon, support us that way. And we got some other big exciting things to come, but we're gonna save that for the next video. I'm not gonna tip that just yet. So thank you for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.